Okay.
I kind of came up with one, but I can't even make it partway through it. But it's something that people requested, and actually I had thought about it, but when I had gone online, I had found there was a thing for a Navajo language alphabet song.
Oh, okay.
And it was really close to Tlingit, but not quite. And I know, I still sing the alphabet song whenever I have to alphabetize anything. Um, so I don't know. The other day it came to me, and so I actually came up with a thing, um, where essentially you sing the alphabet to Ashi Shukde Yita. Okay, I totally bungled that, but um, here, let me see if I can do this. And can you see that?
Ah,
Like I say, I only made it about halfway through, and then I was like, oh, I'm going to have to slow this way down.
are you gonna put vowels at the end of those consonants?
I don't know. Good question.
Yeah.
And this is actually super awesome because this is what I was asking the other day about, would the long vowels be, in this case, quarter notes and the other ones be eighth notes, or the long vowels should be half notes instead of quarters? Like, that's a cool way to notate it.
And I started to try to mess with the song to actually make those where they would time out right, but then yeah, then I
But
realized that
if you had it be two tones, so you could have it connect, so it'd be ah, and instead of just two different letters, two spaces for the letters. It's a cool idea, connecting the two. Some way to remember the stuff.
but yeah,
I'm not sure.
I'll post this to the base camp, and then maybe somebody can actually figure out how to sing it.
You okay? Jeez.
There's a file for music.
Okay. Dad qart was a good thing it she gwallwe shukwa ai khana. Isiku again we clegg thing it she. Yeah, acht was a good to achi. Tadachasa to a tea. Khetaya we yel qaqi a. Ya acht was a good to achi we tatsu. Yeah, we qonish to gachtul to ya khana. Yeah, yiqaqwus qa we tlega we atshi adat. Just tadachasa to was a good. Atusaqo a kek qashi. Kusuhu he awaqa. Anybody want to sing a Tlingit song? Anybody know one? Oh, wait. Was I it was auch Tim. Tlingit keinach.
Hase hachi achuni ha. Hey ya hey ya hey. Ya hey ya hey. Hey ya hey. Hey ya hey. Hey ya hey ya huni ha.
Away can cheese ha.
It's a Ganakari exit song, I believe.
Oh, yak Yeah, awa kanach yak Sukka, chakutatuka, chaknach sati galkiwi, kanachwe kekok dech shukashch say you do sago at it ark. Yeah, we adati tuchutang kanins. We shukashch. Ja, tlauk yes nach sati itch chak nach sati Yeah, we wuchich gedallai hakusti. Yeah, we had to a tea. Gwellell wytysako ko a hellwasaka gwati. Kleide hin a wecho ach kleinach we atshi dati rewatan. Hast du ko kera chukanedi. Ye a wecho ach chuna. Chuna ya aya haswatien chak. Kel chunach ko cha a dein awe. Wush kanachas o da art. Icht. Hast du tuasagu has ausaku. Adusa we ayan nach litzin. Hechwa kanachwe has ausaku. Adat aya. Ka hechwa teen. Has kuwishgawan. Yewe. Wan kanins likudzi ata has ausaku chak. Gwell. Wede kleinach ka. Kanach nachye aya chakut ku. Just has to turn the tani tin wushu has kawul atkin. Akaya ye has wuti. Kelhas awastin koa. Chukani di icht. Kanaya ya adat. Has wushuk. Gosh. Ha I dach awe a kawul chait. A joy klesliat huh. Ye awe ye has yawaka. Aka awe we achi. Kone has awa ach. Dakte has out lakain. Has ausatin. Ye icht. Du yagu yikte awe wuhan. Du itch aya. The kayak the way at leich the katu jishaguni. We achi aya awashi. Yahweh, Yahweh, hu, hey, 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 Yahweh, Yahweh, hu, hey, hey, hey. Klitzina ya atuye ti we achi. On qanins hasu. We khunakawu. Ya gande aya. Hasak wat we achitin. Ye awe shinket shiki. Klitzina tu yeti eka which akudach achi. Ye awe ach tu suku. Ye awe ach. Ya chak away we celebration. Kone yawe hihi. Konachawe ha yukatangi awe. Udu achin. Ja, dat gewoon just chayegu genki tu ach. Ja, ha yukatangi. Ka hakita kaku haste yukatangi zu. Sutskan. De kina. Ach ja tagish ka tashoni. Denke. Ja haste yukatangi wan kaninsa tu ach. Ja awech ach. Ja atcha itch. Kanachwe haste tuasa kushkatilniken. Ka athasa washi. At she tin, play the heen cleochnech and the cowaning. It touched the cut yet think it shakunaya. With the cheese show a cut the niki. Ha a cheek eatin. Ye our adat you took the tanya ye that too. Cheese shach 80s a achi. Adusatsu dutuasagu yuk ewatani that akahastu ide yuk akwatan glade kakinach. Hujaga. Kanshish for singing that entrance song. Made me think of an exit song. So it's always good to hear like an eagle song or a wolf song once you've heard a raven or a crow song. Sometimes they call this thing shukkarchuchts, which is a really fun word. If you've been studying Tlingit for a while, it's a mind bender as well as it's a tongue twister for the folks who are the yeast the new studiers, and it's a brain bender for the Kate Shan, as Chait Wu once referred to some of the ones who've been studying for a while, the old dogs. So shukkarchuchts is a term that I started hearing when I was working on the Raven stories. And the first time I remember hearing it was from Shikshani Marge Dudson. So Raven has this way of, he sings, and then he also uses these specific kind of ways of talking that are very different than the way most people talk. He uses a lot of hortative verbs, and then he'll say some things that are just really pretty ambiguous, like he'll say, Atuski kakanachan kakashi, which is very hard to translate. So atuski, who might, kakanach, going over a person, anqahashi, let them cut. So he was inside of a whale, and we sort of just translated that as who could cut a person out of here. But it gets really tricky to translate. Yeah, I'll put the text into, unless anybody else wants to type how they think it is. I got that stories kind of right here though. But he's doing this, right? So we're listening to these Raven stories, and he starts to do one of these things where he kind of sings something into being. And then as he says this, here it is. Shakshani Marge Dudson, she starts laughing, and she says, he's starting to shukkarchuchts. And I was like, right on. So like, I didn't want to interrupt the flow because we were really working on these translations. Sometimes when you're working with the elders, you're just like, sounds great, I better ask about that one later, but sometimes you ask about it in the moment. And so it's always a balancing act, what you let fly by and what you let sort of, and you take a note of it and ask later, and then other things you try and figure out. But then we started listening to the stories, and then they would start saying, and they started talking about it as well. And I was like, okay, here's one of these moments where like this word keeps popping up. It just keeps popping up. So I look it up in the dictionaries, and I was able to find, so the verb root is chuch, which means to summon something. And then I found some of the definitions in the texts, in the different dictionaries and verb notes and stuff that's out there. And it says to compose songs for the opposite clan, and they're songs that require a response. So I was like, okay, so it's composing. It's like they're composing a song. And then I started asking people about it. And I was going up to Fairbanks. We're having this language gathering up there. Sakingisti, David Kasich. So we had breakfast at the airport in Anchorage. And we're just talking. I says, what does this word mean to you? Shukkarchuchts. And he's stopped me. He said, oh, that's a great word. It means you're calling the end back to the beginning. I was like, okay, I could see how that works, because shu is the end of something. And then, so shukarchuchs. And then it's got like this sort of repetitive sort of thing. And then, so I was thinking about that. And then I started thinking about this other, I was like, well, where are we going to get an Eagles song from? And so when nobody offered one, which is fine, I just said, well, here's one I heard about. I hear a lot of people sing it. It's not everybody's song. It's a Chukanady song. It's a clan that's from Huna and Glacier Bay, and there's several of them in Sitka as well. And there's a story. And someone told this story at Celebration, and so I was always sort of held on to it because I thought it was fascinating to tell in Tlingit. Long time ago, the Icht, they were the healers. They used to get together sometimes, and they could just do really incredible things. They could just, through their mind, talk to someone who's way in a distant land. They could do all kinds of stuff. There's all kinds of stories, all kinds of things that's known about them. And sometimes they used to like to get together and just sort of see who was the most powerful, who could do the most impressive kind of stuff. And so they say like a group of them got together, and then they were laughing because they said, oh, this one guy never showed up. Must be scared of us. They were laughing. Then they heard that song and they looked out on the water and they could see he's standing up in his canoe. And his canoe was coming right at him. And behind him, all his stuff was dancing in the air. And he sang that song. And that gets us up to where we are now. So I thought we'd look at a story that has a song at the end, which is pretty fun. But I thought I'd see, anybody else want to share anything? Adasa. Thoughts, reflections, questions? Cochain is Frank Italio. Let me find the right spot in this story. And then Cochan Cotan is the Tlingit name given to Frederica de Laguna. Frederica de Laguna came to Tlingit country several times. She did work in Angoon, and she also did work in, I had her picture up. Let me do a couple things here real quick. Let's see. And she published a number of different things about Tlingit, which I think are important. And then she also made some really high quality recordings. And so it was really interesting to see what she recorded on, because it's like a spool of wire. I saw it at the American Philosophical Society. They've got it there. It's like this spool, and I don't even know how it worked. Anybody know how that stuff worked? Like a spool of wire that you could record onto? And then let me show you folks a picture. I gotta find it. Hold on.
Did she do Under Mount St. Elias? Was that her series?
Yeah, she did Under Mount St. Elias. Okay. Hasisikuaga. Do you folks know who these two people are?
Would they be Nash and Story since they're together?
Yeah, oh, So let's see, on the left, I believe. Let me get their Tlingit names. I want to make sure I get this part right. Ya qut shahayi owe achjit ach ausawu wa at yahayit showe achjit ausawu. Shinach shachu ka satnach nats kla. Yeowe achtuasagu yisaku nats kla Jillian story. Shachu kwa Constance Nash. Yeowe ha'inye hasjuwanean. Hutsu Kuchan Kutan. We Frederica de Laguna. Ya hachaku kaku inye hasjuwanean. Chaku. Yeowe achtuasagu yisaku. Oh, Gulchish. And yeah, so you can find these old recordings are out there. Very high quality though, like really high quality stuff. Let me see if I could find I want to show you guys a picture because I was working on these recordings, trying to get them as good as I could. And then they go to another team of folks who listen to it. And translation work is really, really hard. So let me show you folks one other thing. Okay, there's that goes there. Trying to make all the technology magic go. So this is what she recorded it on. So if you you look to see original Tlingit by F. de Laguna. It's in like some kind of tape container. And then you sort of zoom in and it's like this little, I wish I had brought a better camera, but it's a little spool of wire. And so I didn't know how those things were recorded. So this is 1950s, the speaker she's working with. So Nora would probably be about 95 years old right now if she were still alive. And at the time I was working with Nora, this is probably 4 years ago or so, and listening to Frank Italio and trying to translate it. It was very, very difficult Tlingit. And Frank Italio is Nora Dowenhauer's mother's father. So it's her great grandfather, probably born around the 1850s, 1860s, Yakutat speaker. And yeah, I thought we'd listen to him talk. And then I'll post the story, and it ends with a song. And so I thought it'd be neat. And I'll give you folks a little backstory on what I know of this recording, and I'll see if there's any questions before we listen to it. Then we'll shift and we'll do like some lessons after that. So they had been working with him, Kuchain, for quite a while. They're trying to get him to tell Raven stories, and he tells a whole series of them, and they're amazing. They're so amazing. And then they went back and they were trying to get him to sing songs or to tell more stories. And I think what he wanted to do was to sing this story that went with this, sing a song that went with a story he had already told them. So then he ends up sort of summarizing a whole bunch of these stories and leading up to the song. At one point, you'll hear him say, hand me the drum. And then you'll hear him say, take it. And then you'll hear him at the end say, I'm just going to use this. So basically, he has, they hand him a drum, and then he keeps telling the story. And then at some point, there's a cigar box, and he grabs a cigar. He gives them the drum, and he takes the cigar box, and he says, I'll just play it on this cigar box. And that's what he ends up doing. And then at the end, you have the Raven and Daylight song. So there's a whole song that goes with the story. Some of you may have heard versions of this story as well. He transforms him. I don't think he transformed himself. I think he fit himself into a spruce needle, and then he ended up making this. He did all kinds of things so that this girl would swallow him, and then he could be born as a baby, and then he could steal these things that this guy had. There's a whole lot to it, and we're going to listen to the short abridged version of the story because that one has the song, and then there's a longer sort of version. Someday this Raven book will come out, but it's not my job anymore to try and get it done. I did all I can. I kicked it over to Jeff Lear and Will Geiger, so good luck to them because it's so hard. It's so hard sitting there. Sometimes I'd sit there with Kakwanish, George Davis, and Shakshani, Marge Dudson. So I got 2 complete libraries of Tlingit with me, and we're listening to these things, and we're like, maybe this? I don't know. So, but luckily there was a translator. Minnie Johnson was there, and she was actively listening to and summarizing a lot of the stories. And that, if that hadn't happened, we probably never would have got them. I don't know. Maybe we would have. Okay. Any questions, thoughts before we look at this thing?
One of my favorite stories around that is right when you folks were starting to work on translations, and I think one of your classes was looking at some things, right? You sent it to maybe an intermediate advanced Tlingit, I don't know, but the longer you start listening to Tlingit and thinking in Tlingit, sometimes it's hard to go back to English, and I can't remember who the speaker was. It might have been Zuboff, but he's telling a Raven story, and the transcript has this one word highlighted and trying to figure out what it is in Tlingit. And I ended up listening to it. I'm like, oh, that's not a Tlingit word. He's saying astronaut. Like he's talking about Raven as falling like an astronaut. And there's all of these like, maybe it's this, maybe it's this in Tlingit. And nobody keeps like, oh, he's just saying astronaut. So you're definitely getting into Tlingitizing your English a little bit, I think.
Yeah, well, that happened to me in Hawaii as well. So I was learning Hawaiian, and I went to a coffee shop, and they had kale chips, Kale. And I looked and I was like, oh, if that was Hawaiian, I'd say kale chips. They're kale chips. And then I was just teasing, and I said that, and they're like, oh yeah, that's how we say kale. I was like, oh, okay. Okay, so this is Frank Italio. I will post both the audio and this thing this evening. It's fun to just listen to the old people, how they used to talk long time ago. It's fast, it's complicated, but there'll be little parts. And so your job as learners, if you're new, just absorb it, catch the rhythm of it, look for things that you might recognize. If you've been studying for a while, like really think about what's going on and how you could take the deep dive into this stuff.
Is he gonna sing another one? Sayete hawaha, sayete hoxiko, sayete hen, hat kankusik aleka, shin khayeke, yikshikahate, yewe. Does he know any of his other songs of Wichita? Yes. So the go ya kat ki kakos te. I kakas kanaus yes ha. The house was the crow. What's that? House was the crow. Ya kat ki kakos te. Kayo to ish something. So the crow. Say that. Is he going to tell a Raven story? Heat corner our heat our reach the yes. Of course, two wood our yet was sock to just to the sock. Our atlet cook to the tea. Who yes. Shinya tea or yes the tea. Yata hukte an was the ye. Atach. This outski what tea to Kazakh. You could to Kazakh. To eat, check to what was what to cheek. You discovered to eat the tea. Was out. Our ticket was what? To sit Kaitanka. Hako data jack. Kazakh. Tea Kazakh. You quit. But you not go out. Out the head. Yeah, Tishaus, the other Jack. To sit there on the skaka. The Skayaka Jack. Our Western Yake, what's up? And tells you what you quit on the Kazakh. However, what I want you that could the hen attack to Nick and Ho. Yes. Listen, I tell you, take a talk to Sunny, you take that, Nakona. The Katia said it at the Kayuka good. But yeah, you tell the cleaner test. That one now. To in the city. Yeah, you tell the cleaner. I take the sick that. I will care Sydney, who yes. Hey, kuna Hoske, I'll call you to a soccer. I go care our coach. The Tatakana Katako, good. That I was cook out it, cook society. I watch you can get out. You a shoot day, a shoot day. You can't cock out. The Haya, the car, what's a you can't cock out. Kutachna Sikiet, so you can't get a Katejo, the Chaka. Kawa. I thought that sack they were good. Yes, ho. Take to touch over you was a yes, you. Pit kaktek. Kasanak. Awa. Holiday to Chikak. Oko. Awa. Nit Benekato lap that took the Tanjukan. Took to the go second water. Awa. Yes, Osaka. So could get a so shy slender. A cut in it so you sleep you Osaka. A jetty in the talk on our hood. Toktanaka coast, you go need like a cut. Takahasi, that is Cochena sent as Cochente Akanatku. Tayes Kakasa, yes, Taka. Yes, yeah, I told yes, you do was so. No, that was the grass. Yeah, well, I yan Kasaku, the Katathoto was so. Yo, cha, the President the Kate. Yes, I go yetin, you kiss Canada. With this critical was story. I will call it إني كونت ويكتا أو قط كاكشت تاكتيكات أو سوات تجويا وسني ككوتيج إني كون يو أوسا أو تكوتيج زوا أقوى تكوتا ويت وأدخل كوتيه أقوى تجيه وقيا اختاتقنا كي كاتاك وقد سقنا سيرتاخ كي كاتاك كوتا ويجيو سقا أخسيتي يكاكن قاقوت هاك وسط يكون خوش كتو تكون ساقوت أتخي ساقوت أتخي تصل تكتت يانا قصيخوخ تخيخ قا صاخ خو أو كأيخ يوان تي لناس صوخ تقيوا تياوا تساقوت أتخي هنشو وقوكت تساقو ستي و تاكتو أتت قاطق تتسينوت كاو أتو شاغاتي تكتو تات تديق داخل أو كوتي تجاتك تجاتي تتقتق ستق تتساي ستين ستق كتخوت كيوت تغاتي كيوت لقد كقارت تجاني تيانا خنا سيتسو تتوسو كتن وتيك أتو تكت ليا وستكنو تكت كي آيوسني كت كي أو كوت أشي تخسكو أتتلق قد قاوة يودع كي وكوتي كا يو كي لكوت تخوت كتاك التلخي وأدخ يل يدو وصاك تتيودو وصا يل يقاشانك تعطي وصيغيخ شقاقت لسيت الساكن نيت باك كات تقتانك كوسكو وتوجه أوصا تختتيني سكو تكت يدي يكو تكتات للجتانك أوات يتكيسي كاياك أو تيكو تشيتي أو تياكو يس ياكو أو كتوا أوشكا يشكي ينكو تيا أو تيكو تشيتي يا تخني توساك وتخويا تقاطي توتي أقص تو آتاغي آتا أو تخن تقاوة كاوة خش تاغتخ أو تكوكو يوت سويتك تيخاو ستي فجوان تاكاوة هاسكي كتناوت شنو خوتو خش أو هو يسوى يقوى نوك تهيتي قوية دخلت وتكتسيسي تنخ ناسو ستخشي تاخاو ستس أولي تتنخ أتكت نيك أهو كياتك الشو يل أقيتي ته يتخوت ليخ يا واه
Is he gonna songs that go with a story he's been telling? Ask him if he would do that.
What's that? Kat kao ko to see you go. Kat kao ko to see. Khosiku. Khosiku khit ko skait khosiku. Akta ko le trosiku. We kao tek ye kao ta awa. Ah, shiko ke kao si te tu chi hu yo krea. Pinasak ta kao ko. Kat ko khos pinasak ko. Ku te. Ana te itsu te ha. Awe ko tita khawa. Akawa te kata tau te kākhia si te tīsko. Nāsi ke yes. Te tīsko khosa te. Tā sakot khana tā kētsi kānak to te koutu waket. Te kanta kawa tsioko te kata sengi tā dik yai wane yokot khana ha. Awa te testa tsak kākh. Awa tā te khana ye tōto ta khana. Wala si ke yes kate so waka ti te kawa na. Te kate te yutu te. At khat ku tawa kata kame ki kata ku wakut. Chaho to kosi ya te si kosko chaho tu te si kosko. Ke Shaktu wa uke te keni kudye
Yewe wishkalni qa'atshi. Qatlan yini. Qatlan choya wichatl eat ka. Yewuti. That's the story. That's the song. That's the deep waters. Like he was walking around with the where the halibut live. There's lots there. If you know all those stories, he's really, he jumps around as he was telling them in that particular case. But maybe like things were really fluid as well in terms of time and the sort of the way. A lot of times these stories are told in a row. There's a bunch of them. They call him Ye Xiu, and I think Ye Xiu is a name, and I think it means a white raven. But I can't get people to agree with me on that one, so I might just have to sort of, I don't know, just tell you. That's what I think it is. But thoughts, reactions, questions, and then we'll probably take a break and then go into something. We'll pull it back. We'll go back to the shallow waters, but that's a big story. It's a series of stories.
That's a wonderful recording.
Yeah. And I'll tell you folks kind of a funny story. So we'd been working off sort of second, third generation recordings, and they were not nearly as clear as that. And so we're getting frustrated because we'd have to listen to it so loud and trying these different noise reduction techniques and software. And then this before I knew what the American Philosophical Society was. Anybody know what that is? It's called the APS. Can somebody tell me what it is?
The part I've been learning about is that they started when Thomas Jefferson sent out people to gather vocabulary lists from all of the indigenous people they could find.
Really?
Yeah. Ben Franklin was like involved with it, and so it's when I first was hearing about it, I was like, what is this? Like philosophers or something? And it's basically like an archive and a museum. They reach out to a lot of indigenous communities and they work on digitizing materials. And they also house a lot of stuff. Like a lot of De Laguna's collection is there. And so and that yes, they have grants. If you work in indigenous languages, you could become a scholar. They'll fly you there. You get like $3,000 to do some sort of project. Really great, nice people. It's in Philadelphia. If you go, I'll give you my. I was only there for a couple of days, but just in terms of like, so we couldn't get a high quality recording. We're listening to this thing so loud. I was like, I'm just destroying my ears trying to hear this because the clang gets so hard. It's people don't talk like this anymore. It's Yakutat dialect, and there was just a whole bunch of factors, and so you had to like sort of be like in their sort of group to get some sort of access to these recordings. And I didn't know anyone there, and James Crippen didn't know anyone there, but he says, you know, if you know someone who knows someone there, they might grant us some access to these recordings. So I went to this this archival librarian that I knew in Alaska that I was friends with. And I won't say their name because maybe they'll get embarrassed. Great person, great ally, did a lot of work with them. And I said, do you know anyone over there? And like, yeah, I know some people. Can you help us get this recording? We're trying to just get this recording so we listen to this thing. So he wrote an email, and it had the greatest, perhaps the greatest typo of all time. So what this person meant to type was, hello, Bob, or whatever the person's name is. Hello, so-and-so. They're trying to get this recording. Could you help them get this recording? And so, hello, they're trying to get this recording. It's just pretty straightforward professional email. But this person forgot the O. They missed the O. So it was like, hell, Bob, they've been trying to get this recording. It's just like a whole different tenor. And I saw the email and I said, this is the greatest typo I've ever seen. And we got the recording like right away. Like it was so fast. But since that time, I've made some connections. I've gone over there. They're wonderful archivists. They want to work with indigenous communities. I got to see wax cylinder recordings, this wire thing. they took the whole digitized De Laguna collection and they brought it to Yucatan, and it's there. And then I've got copies. If you want the De Laguna stuff, you want to dig around through it, you can. It's also have all these digitized little recipe cards. Had written a whole bunch of vocabulary, a whole bunch of stuff on there. And so like, but why was this stuff recorded? So that we would have it and that we can work in it. So it's yeah, it's a time travel. It's a mind bender a lot of times, because you're going in and there was a whole bunch of stuff that he talked about in there, including some bad names. According to Kuchain, the name for raven comes from Yeshlitli, which is a pretty, I don't know, it means you're poopy. It's to say it nice, like poopy raven. Yeah, other thoughts?
Well, Khune, I have a question.
Uh-huh.
Because we've talked a lot about how it's difficult for elders to speak because they were beaten as children for speaking their language. So how do you have part of the population going out and making recordings and getting vocabulary since Ben Franklin, and then the huge population who's then trying to beat it out of them? That I'm surprised that there's both.
Yeah, because I was working with Marge, and she went through incredible violence. But those were educators. Those were people who ran schools, and that sort of line goes right up to Sheldon Jackson, who was the director of education in Alaska, basically, and also there was a period of time where Alaska was governed by the military. Then the military starts bombing Tlingit communities. So then they sort of, okay, well, let's try the churches. So the churches were governing Alaska up until probably statehood, maybe. And so basically, Sheldon Jackson and some others divided Alaska between these religions, and then they went and they missionized, and they also they were the authorities. So they got to say whether or not people could speak their language, whether or not you could dance with masks, whether or not you could make new songs, and how many and how often you could have your ceremonies. So it was highly regulated. There was no freedom of religion until the 1970s. There was there was all kinds of stuff too, because you add on top of that, putting children, taking them out of their homes and putting them into non-native families, forced sterilizations of women. I mean, there's all these things, and all these contribute to language loss. But then we're here working with this stuff. And for those of you who are new to Tlingit, you know, as you listen to this stuff and read the stories, there's tons of stuff to think about. And if you've been working with Tlingit for a long time, you sit down and look at this stuff, and it's just, sometimes I get overwhelmed, and I think, how do we ever get back to where we were? Because, you know, if I wanted to just really talk about this stuff and work in this stuff, there's very few people I can really talk to about it. And then when you add in like just personalities and politics, like there might, like I saw this article one time and it said like the last two speakers of this language refused to talk to each other. And I was like, yeah, it's probably gonna be us if we got to that point, you know, just like, oh yeah, I know him, I hate him, right? And so like, but those are some realities in language revitalizations, trying to overcome those things and just because it's easy to get distracted. It's easy to sort of say, you know, we're in a meeting the other day and someone was like, okay, first of all, I want to fix everything. I'm like, just learn this language, use this language, learn this language, use this language. So.
Part of the reason we have, you know, that disparity of educators refusing or, you know, physically beating folks into not speaking, and yet we have these recordings, is the academics, so anthropology and linguistics, were at the time operating under this assumption of what's called salvage anthropology. So the assumption was Indigenous communities, even though they continue to exist, like we still exist, that indigeneity and Indigenous folks were just going to either disappear, either be assimilated, or not be alive anymore. And so these scholars were trained in a certain way to go and basically salvage things. And so we have a lot of these recordings and objects and things like this that were taken with that mindset that they were being preserved, not maybe seeing the dissonance of you're preserving something that people are saying and speaking, and maybe if you really wanted to preserve that, you wouldn't then also have this boarding school system. But that's part of the reason why we do have so much recording of Tlingit that goes back, a long time in multiple different, Pennsylvania, there's objects in Russia that are Tlingit, these sorts of things. And so, yeah, part of that was the way academics kind of built their career, starting with Swanton and Boas on working in Indigenous communities and recording people, not actually, now, we're going back and using these recordings as language revitalization tools, but their purpose was not that, at least in the beginning. And so those disciplines in particular are also going through hopefully some positive growing pains, just like the university is, as far as supporting the community and not just supporting this abstract concept of knowledge in that sort of way.
For me, it's so neat to hear that old language and kind of his pacing and the language he uses. And that song, he says, I heard it or I learned it from the lips of my grandparents. And so it's real old language that he's using, and how much the language I use has changed, eh? Like I'm so basic. When you say beginner or whatever, I know I'm not a beginner, but there's me and there's Frank Italio, eh? And I was working with Keishi a week and a half ago on that video of Lagoon, that second one you sent me. And there were a couple of things she said. She's quoting her grandmother. And I said, I don't think I've ever heard that before, and Keishi says, and you probably won't hear it again, eh? Like that. So it's just that, and that's from 5 years ago, or maybe just over 5 years ago. So how quickly the language is changing. But yeah, it's just wonderful to hear these old speakers, and that it's still there. Really, it's there for us to latch on to.
Yeah, wow. Yeah, I feel like sometimes some of our work is like, let's get everybody talking like teenagers could long time ago, right? Like, so, and not just like, if we could all talk like little kids long time ago, then that's really good. And then we're going to take this handful and we're going to try and get into the deep waters with this. What happens to Tlingit when it gets to this really high level stuff? And it does. The grammar gets super complicated, these particular words and phrases and other things. And then I feel like that's what we're trying to do, is just get a whole bunch of people conversational and then take this group and say, okay, we got to go to these deep waters to make sure that these concepts and these stories and these ways of using the language don't get lost. And this is storytelling and speech making are very elevated forms of Tlingit. And same with doing prayer and stuff like that, and any sort of ceremonial language. It's sort of like you got to really bump it up to this whole other level. And so, yeah, it can be intimidating. And so sometimes when we're asking people like, where are you at with the stuff? It's tough to take a look, because yeah, you just, and learning a language is so interesting too, because you're just grinding along and it feels like you can't do very much. And then somebody says something and you just understand them. It's so interesting. It's different than a lot of other stuff, because sometimes you can't really see the progress you're making, which is really interesting.
Yes, Aktuusigu Echa Gao. I heard Mr. Atalio say, and I realized that he was saying Raven was crying, and that's because I pried apart that verb for crying. So thank you. I had a real illuminated moment.
Renee,
Ah,
Hathea, was he, when he's saying Frank Italio, that was a really beautiful recording. Chade chatna u linget hesh linget u chatangi English enach chade. He, when the whale, and I heard him do that sound, and it sounded just like a whale going in the water. And I was wondering if he was just clearing his throat or if he actually made that sound. That was awesome.
yeah, it's a good question. And he runs through this cycle of stories very fast. So basically, the birth of Raven. So Raven's uncle was the moon. You know, you'll see that big moon tonight, and in Tlingit they'll say the moon was on the earth long time ago, and it was called Yuqisqulqiq, the tide controller, and it was terrified everything and everybody. It was mean. Had a sister, and the moon's sister. Oh, I had to look up the name. I always forget the name. Why do I always forget the name? She has a name.
You can cook cake.
Sheesh. And so she would have these babies. She would just have a baby. No one came near her. She would just have a baby. And the moon had these slaves and his wife, and they would go, every time she had a baby, they would go kill it. And so she's crying because like her babies keep dying and getting killed by her brother. And basically he didn't want the kids to grow up and molest his wife. It's a really wild story, right? And so so she's crying, and then there's two main versions. In Cochane's version, he's the only one that I think I know of that says this. It's a killer whale named Gush Tuwul who comes up to her. In every other version, it's a heron, Shak, that comes up and advises her and says, okay, yeah, go find this rock below the tide line. It's perfectly round, and you build a fire, and then when it's just warm enough to touch, you swallow it. And then you have a baby that nothing could kill. And so that's how Raven was born. And he does all these tests. His uncle had all these tests, and that's the way he'd kill his nephews. And then Raven, he can't get killed. And so he just does everything, and he defeats his uncle. And then he goes back to his uncle's house and is looking for his wife, because he knows the wife was also involved in this thing. And he's got her hidden in a box up in the rafters, and he has the slaves of his uncles bring her down, and she's got flicker feathers in her armpits. And he plucks them out and throws them at his uncle, and they become flickers, and that frustrates his uncle, and his uncle floats up above and goes where the moon is now and floods the whole world. And so then there's a whole other series of stories. Like that's the short, tiny version. The other one that he touches on is Raven and the Tide. So there was a little elder that sat on the tide, and he tricked that elder into, well, he flipped the elder upside down and hit him on their butt with a sea urchin shell until they let go of the tide, because they were holding on to it. And then that's how the tide started, and because he wanted people to be able to eat sea urchins and tide foods. And then so he touches on that one, and then he ends up with, then there's Raven, he goes in this whale, and that's a whole other story that he touches on. And then he tells all of these in other recordings. So we've got them basically in sequence. And then there's probably a few other ones, but then it ends with Raven in the Box of Daylight, and that's where he gets to here, where there's these people fishing for driftwood, and he starts saying, in this version, he's saying, ach shude. In other ones, he says, ach eit I woo. The first one, ach shude, is translated as come get me. And ach eit I woo is send something for me to eat. And then he says, maybe I'll break the daylight on you. And and then he ends up doing that. So they're complicated stories, and so as he's retelling them, he's drifting between the stories as well. Like, so you'll as you go through and read the whole thing, then you get to this one, he's summarizing it, but he's talking about the whale, then he's talking about the tide, then he'll talk about the box of daylight, then he'll go back to the tide, and then and so it's really interesting. This is a very fluid version because he just drifts in between all those stories.
I was thinking about time just in general, and I think there is a a cultural aspect of how time is viewed. And someone had mentioned, I feel like I time traveled, and then today I was I met with Shken to talk about some curriculum things, and we talked about Raven stories that maybe the stories I'd heard, I don't know what came before and I don't know what came after, because I have a really limited view, having not heard as many stories as maybe someone who either grew up here or especially who grew up within the Tlingit culture. My question is, sorry, long framework, is time, are they in an order? Like, do you think of one as first, second, and third, or is that more abstract than my view of time? So, of the way it's been taught to me.
Both. So yes. So if you tell one, it's called Yesh Shkashnik. If you tell them in a row, it's Yesh Kutlak. And different storytellers tell them in different. If I were to tell them all in order, I would probably go Raven being born, Raven makes the illusions, Raven and fire, Raven and water, Raven and the tide, Raven and the salmon box house, Raven and the killer whales, Raven deceives his brother. Well, maybe those ones were reversed. Raven deceives his brother, then Raven and the killer whales, Raven hosts a potlatch, Raven and the whale, and then probably ending with Raven and the box of daylight. That seems to be the last one. Yeah. And then we can look at how time, that's a good question. I'll show you some illustrations and we'll look at, there's also just sort of day-to-day time, because part of the thing as well, basically there's all this stuff right now, and there's chok, which is long time ago, which I think is, could be 40 years ago, all the way back to as long as we can collectively remember. Then we get into tuggu, which is, we know it happened, but no one can remember anything about it. That's going under the glacier, clan migrations, coming up from the south to the north, Raven, all those things are all tuggu, mammoths, like we were around, like Tlingit people were speaking Tlingit and there were mammoths walking around. We got a name for them, and so it's interesting. And then within the language itself, time is not a driving logical factor. It's just a thing. Whether or not it has happened is probably the primary logical factor in the language. And that's where it can get kind of confusing, because there's some things like you'll use what English would consider a past tense, even though it's happening right now. And so Ida can tell you all, she wrote a whole thesis about this. She's but it's really interesting to sort of look at how all that stuff works. And then as we're learning the language and using the language, it plays a role, because our English brain probably wants to reject the idea of all these sort of challenging time and space, right? So it's like, what, and so, but it's really fun. So we should probably take a break. Maybe we'll come back at 6:48 on my clock. So let's come back at 7 o'clock and we'll talk about time. Then we'll do some stuff that's maybe a little easier, and then we'll have a bit more conversation. الشيش. Okay. Yuk'eich Satini. Gaudat. So time. Let's talk about it. So this presentation talks about a few different concepts in time, and then I think we'll also talk about verbs a little bit here. Time is important. I think time helps us tell stories, put things together, sequence things as we learn more and more Tlingit. And some of us are just learning the names of stuff and some basic phrases, and we're going to touch on some of that as well. But just thinking about this, let me go over a few things. In the top left, I put this phrase up here that I really like. Yende ya yanaitlak. So we're going to say that. Everybody just say the first part. We're going to say yende.
Yande.
Yende.
Yande.
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 Yende.
Yande.
I'm going to say the second part, these next two words. Ya yanaitlak.
Ya
Yande.
Yanetlak.
Ya yanaitlak.
Yanaka.
We'll do one word at a time. Ya.
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 Yeah.
Ya.
Yanaitlak.
Yanetlak.
Yanaitlak.
Yande. Ayan. Yak.
Yanaitlak.
Yanetlak.
Yanetlak.
Yende ya yanaitlak.
Yande ya.
Yande ya yanaka.
Yende ya yanaitlak.
Yande
ya
Yanetlak.
You all are on the verge of succeeding. Obtaining it. You're getting it. Then we go down here in the blue. In this one, we'll say we'll just try them both together. Yachkuha.
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 Yachkuha. Yachkuha.
That is season. So fall, winter, spring, summer, those are all yachkuha. And the literal interpretation of yachkuha is the time comes. Keeps coming, keeps arriving.
Suye yanaka. Kune. Yaundaka.
Yachkuha.
Yachkuha.
So the first part, yach.
Yach.
Second part, kuha. So then we will go and we got some sort of, we're just going to talk about some different ways that we talk about time. So a single day, we'll get into the 3 or 4 ways you could say this word. We'll just start with this one. I'm not saying it's the better one or anything like that. Yaki.
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 Yaki. Yaki. Yaki.
Yaki. So yaki is a day, right? Like 1 day, 2 days, yaki. A month, and this is also the word for moon, dis.
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 And then a year, which is also the word for winter.
Dis.
Tak. Talk.
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 Talk. Talk. Talk.
Talk.
Goodness, geez. So this is day.
Julie Yanaka talk.
Talk. Hold on. Talk.
Talk. Talk.
Talk.
Talk.
Talk.
Yeah. So sometimes you like, so when you get this KW at the end, right? So here's, it's a 3-letter word. The T, the long, high A vowel. And then the KW. Okay, so those are the 3 parts to this word. It is pretty common to hear the rounding. So by rounding, what we're saying is like your lips go forward. Talk. So you see your lips go forward at the end. It's pretty common for it to start rounding even before we get to the K. It just happens sometimes. I don't know if that's a right or wrong thing to say. So if I don't round it until I get to the K, I would say talk. If I round it before I get to the K, talk. So you hear that ow sound? This is similar to when you hear people say, wasa itu wasak. But you'll hear people say, wasa itu wasak. That rounding is coming a little bit early. But I don't know if that's okay or not. Another one would be yak as a boat as opposed to yauk. So it's just something to watch. I guess I kind of recommend not rounding it too early. So instead of going ow, we're going right there. Talk.
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 Okay. Other speakers, teachers, chime in if you got thoughts about the rounding thing as well. Okay. So let's talk concepts of time. So this illustration, I might make it a little bit, just a smidge smaller. There we go. Oh, no, I'm not gonna do that, okay. So the top one is sort of a smaller concept, like sort of like getting into a single day, and then a couple days after, a couple days before. Then the bottom set is sort of bigger concepts of time. And so this is just kind of how time roughly works in Tlingit. So there's 4 different ways to say day, D-A-Y, the English word day. So one of them is Yuk-yi. Another way, Yug-yi. Yug-yi. Another one is Yug-yi. Yug-yi. Another one.
Yagi, Kone. Yagi, it's a good day.
Yeah. 4th way, Yagi. Yagi. Wherever you're at, find someone who could speak some Tlingit and say it like they do. It is a dialect question. You say this word, right? I don't know, I probably go back and forth between Yuk-yi and Yug-yi. I don't know. I just change over the years, but so
Yagi.
That's the word for day. So if you get to today, you would start with ya. It's like this day,
Right.
today. So for today, we'll say Yayagi.
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 So there are some concepts in Tlingit, which is sort of like old school Tlingit. I think you're supposed to be up when the sun's up. You're supposed to go to bed when the sun goes down. But, you know, that's just sort of, things are different, maybe perhaps now. I'm probably getting up here and maybe I'm going to bed here. So, you know, whatever. But when we have, when the day breaks, it's all about when the sun rises. So the sunrise, we're going to look at this word right here. And there's two versions of it. Okay? Two versions of it. One of these, this word means daybreak. And we'll say K-a.
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 Now here's a major diamond. Whether you go the A sound or the E sound. So if you're from maybe Angoon, Southern Tlingit, Daysleen, Yakdat, you might say K-a.
K-a.
K-a. Both of those words are daybreak or dawn. They come from the verb means for the day, for the sun to rise, right? This is what Raven says. Yikaki anquakuts. Complicated way to say, I might break the daylight on you. There's a bit of a more specific term. So like if you were to look at the horizon where the sun's going to rise, when that sun first breaks the horizon, right when it first breaks the horizon, that is called the mouth of the dawn. And the way we say that, there's two ways to say that. So we already got this underlined K at the front. So we're going to up the difficulty and put this underline apostrophe X towards the end. So we get K-a.
K-a.
K-a. K-a. K-a. K-a. Or K-a. 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 And everybody has, we have multiple, but you have at least one. Eh. Eh. It's mouth, right? Okay. So there's the dawn. We get into the morning time. Utat.
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 Julia Yanaka, Kone.
Utat.
Awe, tutat. Yak a tutat.
Utat.
Tutat.
Yeah, what? When we get into midday, there's two ways to say this. One for if you're an inland speaker, especially from Teslin or Carcross. And then there's everybody else. We'll do the inland one first. We're going to change this W un M. Sitgam san.
Sitgam
Sitgam
san.
Sitgam san.
Sitgam san.
Sitgao san.
Sitgam san.
Sitgao san.
Sitgam san.
Midday, noon. Okay.
Sitgam san. In Daisling Kwan. Sitgam. Tuyanka.
Sitgam san.
Sitgam san.
Yeah, so then, once we get into dusk, so the sun is setting, we're getting into the dusk time, we have Hi'a.
Hi'a.
Hi'a. Hi'a.
Hi'a.
Hi'a.
Hi'a.
So just this X without, there's no underline on here. If there's an underline on this X, you have no underline.
Tuyanka. Hi'a. Hi'a.
Hi'a. So this first sound, this X sound, there's a number of things in the world that make this sound. I think a jet airplane makes this sound. Alaska Airlines making this sound all day, every day. A cappuccino machine.
Air North.
Yeah, Air North. Air Canada. Cappuccino makers. And people who'd make a sound like the wind. It was a windy night. That's the X sound. The deep sleep, nice snoring is the underline X sound. Okay, that goes further back there. Gotta control those. See which one it is. Hi'a. Hi'a. The dusk.
Kune.
Asa.
Daisling Kwan. Hi'a.
Like Hi'a. Hi'a. Hi'a.
Hi'a.
Yeah, what? So you can't make that sound, not that one. It's the sound. That's too far back. Don't do the thing. Hi'a.
Hi'a.
Yeah, Yeah, So once we get into the sort of getting to supper time, all the way to what's normal bedtime. But I'm gonna tell you how to live your life. But basically, supper time until it's getting pretty dark. But pretty, let's say probably around 5 o'clock until, well, here it depends on the season.
Yeah, that's a good word.
But even like, it might
when
be.
Grandma's about to tell her stories after dinner.
That's right. Well, yeah, when we get into tot, Grandma's locking the door, right? So that's the other thing too. Like, but the evening is Chana.
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 But we're not
Chana.
not
Chana.
Not Chana. Chana is a significant other.
Oh.
Chana is the evening. So we gotta control this. We're not going there yet. Chana.
Chana.
Same place in your
Kana.
mouth where you make a K sound. Right on the roof of your mouth.
Oh, wait. Kana.
Yeah, it helps to have a little, you gotta have like some saliva on your tongue to properly make the sound.
Kana.
Yeah, what?
Anna.
Hindana. Hindana.
Okay. We get into the nighttime. Tot.
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 Yeah. And then midnight. Tot.
Tot.
Tot. Sit.
Kune yanaka night. Kune.
Tot. Tot.
Tot. Sit son.
Yeah. What? So midnight. Tot. Sit gao san.
Tot.
Son.
Tot. Sit gao san.
Tot. Sit gao san.
Or Tot Sit Gum San.
Oh, wait. Kune yanaka.
Tot.
Isling on. Tot. Sit gum san.
Tot Sit Gum San.
Tot. Sit son.
Okay. So that's the
Tot.
course.
Sit gum san.
So if we go forward, we'll just go forward one day. So tomorrow, there's two ways to say it. I'm going to pick this bottom form. Seqanin.
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 We go back a day to yesterday. Tatke.
Tatke.
Tatke. So
okay.
that's
Kune. Julie. No, sitcom. Julie and tomorrow. The first one.
Seqanin.
Yake. Seqanin. Ka. Seqanin ka. The other one.
Tatke. Yeah, what? So yesterday, today, tomorrow. Tatke yayagi seqanin.
Tatke yayagi seqanin.
Tatke yayagi seqanin.
Tatke. Yayaki. Seqanin.
Okay. So those are day. You could do like day after tomorrow, day before yesterday. Those are getting a little bit complicated. And then you get into the other day. Again, there's some fun stuff in there. Tliya is sort of further along or further down. So tliyatke would be the other day. But the important ones, I think, is starting with tatke, yayagi, seqanin. Right? So just framing things in these sort of within a matter of one day, right? And then we'll sort of start to look at this stuff in terms of what does the verb do? And the verb does a lot once you start moving it around. But we're going to jump down and look at some big concepts of time.
Kune.
Asa?
Katina Shaye. I heard of this weird concept about time, and in Teslin they say yesterday when the elders talk, it was just yesterday, and it was like 20 years ago.
Huh. Okay.
And then they talk, and then some others talk like yesterday, like it was just yesterday. It's a weird concept, time.
They blend together sometimes. Sheesh.
And Renee, also, you mentioned specifically that the Khik'ah is the dawn, like sunrise. Is there sunset?
Well,
Or the mountain's the opposite, but you didn't mention specifically sunset.
well, Chi'ah is the dusk.
Okay, so but it is that specific, like in Western thought, that exact time of the no more sun.
Yeah, yeah. So it's sort of like, I would say Chi'ah is that moment where the sun is coming up, and then Chi'ah is the moments after the sun has set. And so that's kind of, I think, how, and then you could say, you can move it into verbs to talk about the sun is rising. Ke nachich, and then ye nachich is talking about like the motion of it as a heavenly object, basically.
Okay.
But yeah, so Qi'ah and Chi'ah are the opposites, though. The dawn and the dusk is probably how I think of them. And then yes, in the chat, Qih is the name for cake, and it comes from Qi'ah, the mouth of the dawn. Yeah, what?
So I got a question about this.
Ah.
If it was the old calendar kind of like a lunar calendar?
Yep.
Because I heard that the old timers would follow the lunar calendar, so.
Yeah, and so it's been more or less, it's been adopted to the 12-month sort of calendar, but it was a lunar calendar. So there were 13 months and they all had their own names, but the names of the months varied quite a bit from place to place. But yeah, everything followed the moon.
Kune.
Ah.
Dasa Slinketeno Yukatangi. Excuse me. I keep wanting to say in German, Entschuldigung, which is excuse me.
Well, so there's this phrase. So let me put this phrase in on this thing. I guess I'll just use this one. Okay, let me change some things around here. So there is this phrase. I'm going to talk about this phrase then. Oops. So here's this phrase, and let me put the translation in here. So this phrase is cha'adeh. This is how you say.
Forgive me if I say anything wrong.
Yeah. Okay. Now let's go through it. Hold on. So we'll do this in chunks. Okay. Cha'adeh.
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 Ye khatna'u.
Ye khatna'u.
Ye.
Yay.
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 Khat.
Khat.
Na'u.
Cha'adeh ye khatna'u. Cha'adeh ye khatna'u.
Cha'adeh ye khatna'u.
Cha'adeh ye khatna'u.
Cha'adeh ye khatna'u. So this is not the same as excuse me. Because in English, when you say excuse me for so many things, you might say, I'm walking near you. I'm standing in your area. I burped, I farted, you could say it when you're sort of angry at someone, like, excuse me, right? And so like the tone of your voice plays in, the situation, social situation sort of plays a role. But if you're going to say this one, you probably have really messed up, right?
Yak. I'm thinking about more like gunasach. Excuse you. When someone sneezes.
Yeah, so there's no
Bless you,
equivalent because
gunasach.
we were using this like for a whole bunch of stuff, and the elders were saying you only need to say that when like you're trying not to mess something up or you made a mistake. So if it's gotten pretty serious, then you would use a phrase like this. But there's no real thing for like if you're in my way, or just a bunch of things that excuse me is sort of generally used for.
You're in my way. Chukwakuku.
It's like chuk.
Yeah, you say chuk or
Chuk.
so chuk
Mm-hmm.
or juk is like saying scram, I think is pretty much an equivalent. So chuk is, if you know them, it's probably okay. If you don't know them, you might get yourself in trouble. But you can.
Chukwane.
Wasak sakshawe achjika nachega. Achite de shikon shakao ishisukuga. Achjika nachku.
Chukwakuku.
Elpusuku eka chikanako aksha.
Oh.
Elpusuku.
So let me double check this one. So they taught us this one.
Ishan Chade Yé Hatnau Hune Daisling Kwan. I heard this lots growing up. Chukwakuku.
Huh. Well, so we'd say achchikanachku is get out of my way. But it's not always rude, right? Like, so like, let's say this is a Tlingit speaking environment. Someone's standing here, not really paying attention, and I'm trying to just sort of get past them. I could say achchikanachku. And it's not being rude, it's just saying like, get out of my way. It sounds rude in English, no matter how you sort of say it. Because in English, you would say excuse, but this is a cultural sort of communication. Then we got another one that popped up in the chat. I guess we would say that. Yakaku. Yakaku.
Yagaga.
Yakaku.
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 Yeah, so yakaku is sort of like get to stepping, get walking, right? But it just means walk, start walking. But
Giddy up.
Yeah, get going.
Juan.
Back to time. Okay.
It's Hune, Mary. These questions, you know, some of the questions are being asked is real Western. So if you can understand Hune, you're trying to turn off Tlingit and put on Western, and take Western off and turn on Tlingit, you know, to try and answer your question. It's not always easy, because some of our words, our language, doesn't have words for that. So a lot of times when you hear some of our elders speak and they'll be speaking fluently, and then all of a sudden they throw in a couple of words, Western culture, and then they carry on with what they're talking about. So you'll hear it, it almost sounds like it's broken language, but they're still staying on track and trying to stay focused on what they're trying to say to you. So I can understand Hune, you know, this, I can feel it. So it's trying to teach you how to think like we think, and you almost need to put on your Tlingit hat, you know, like many of us wear different hats, you know. So when you come to class, put on your Tlingit hat and just think in that frame mind, and not so much, well, how do you say, or tell them I want this right now, or move over. You know, we don't, there's those kind of words, we don't say that in our language. So that's why you can hear the struggle of how one would say that. What?
Yeah, well, okay. Because yeah, there's a lot of this, the cultural context has to be part of it. And as you're speaking Tlingit, like, and as you learn more Tlingit, you're gonna learn some commands, you're gonna learn some other things. You're gonna, you know, like if you say chook to grandma, then we'll all be like, oh, I knew him. He was a good person, right? So like the kinship structure plays a role in this, and also like clans. Like if you're an eagle person and you're talking to a raven, if you know them really well and there's not a whole bunch of people listening, there's a whole lot you can do. But if someone else is there that you don't know, now you've got to be careful. So even saying something like chook, or like it could be, you know, there could be some raised eyebrows as people say, whoa, you're gonna violate our cultural ways of being by doing some of this stuff. And so it's good to know how to say some of these things, like even teasing and stuff. And there's a whole lot you could say, whole lot you could do. But yeah, it's sort of like talking to your parents or something like that, you know. Sometimes you just have to deal with them being there and say, you're the, I'll go around. And so a lot of this also has to do with just your upbringing. Like we were working with some Hawaiians and we were asking them some stuff. Like we said, could you correct your parents, like your dad, if he was really having a hard time, like say he was drinking or something, and you needed to sort of suggest a different route for their behavior? And they said, never. And so for us, like a lot of this stuff comes down to this as well, like understanding how to use the language. It's way more than just making the sounds and learning the words and putting them together and building these phrases. There's a whole bunch that goes to it as well. Like you could say something like, forgive me if I say anything wrong, is basically what you're saying. So there are times where we could start, you could stand up and start a speech with a phrase like that. You would put this Y on there if you're saying it to groups of people. I'm learning Tlingit. And there's ways that you can communicate this stuff to people so that the ones who are listening to you, they might give you a lot of grace, right? And they'll let a lot of things go. But if you know Tlingit and you stood up and you made a whole bunch of critical cultural errors, like it gets into some pretty interesting territory, because your whole clan could get in trouble and have to have a debt to pay if you do it the wrong way, right? So for Tlingit, like everybody can make mistakes, but if you're in the cultural context, you're in ceremony, you're doing something, and then you sort of take it too far, then there's a time when you're going to have to use something like this. And so some of these phrases, they could be just real fun, they could be funny, but then sometimes they could be really serious. Like maybe you make fun of someone and they're going through a hard time. Then you realize it, and you hurt somebody's feelings. And then, you know, there's some stuff that you could say after that as well. And yeah, the other types of things. So sometimes this stuff does get to up to the clans and up to major disagreements and major sort of hurt feelings and other things like that. And all this stuff plays a role. Yeah. Okay.
Also, to go back to just briefly to what Nishkagoge was talking about, it actually really is challenging for your brain to go back and forth between languages. Like that's why simultaneous interpreters are amazing, like to be able to go from one language to the Keishi, who interprets the simultaneously interprets their general council meetings. Amazing. Yeah, so it actually is a really hard task to ask somebody to go back and forth like this. So for folks who are thinking about working with fluent speakers or who do work with fluent speakers, it's a good idea to find a way of staying in Tlingit and then maybe going to English or you know, staying in English and sort of break it up into chunks and not go back and forth like this, because it's really tiring for your brain. And it's often why if you've studied other languages and you start studying Tlingit, you'll think about those German words, those Spanish words, because you're trying to access that other language part of your brain and you're building new pathways. So it's, yeah, going back and forth, very challenging. So sheesh, One for doing it and for the other teachers who do it all the time. But yeah, for folks who work with speakers, definitely think about finding a way to limit that back and forth.
Okay. Okay. Sheesh. And yeah, ask the questions as they come up, or bring up some things that you're thinking of as we sort of move forward with this content. Okay. My dog is being bad. Kate. Just chews herself out of everything. Okay, sorry. So let's talk about some bigger concepts of time, right? And so these are things we gotta, as you learn another language, especially going from like English to Tlingit, you gotta reprogram like whole parts of your brain sometimes. And it's really interesting because some people who grew up with Tlingit, like they already know a whole bunch of this stuff. It's just sort of conceptually there because they've been around Tlingit speakers who have these sometimes fluid senses of time, you know. And then for other people, it's sort of like if you're new to the language, you're also trying to sort of like rethink whole concepts sometimes. So let's look at a couple of different things. So sort of like looking at something that's happening kind of right now. There's a couple different ways you talk about right now. Generally, you could say yidat.
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 Yidat. And so yidat means now. Ya, you could put ya in front of it. Ya yidat would be sort of like right now. And then there's some different things you can do with yidat. You could say yidati de up until now. Yidati dach from now forward. You can also use this to modify a noun. So Tlingit is a human being or a Tlingit person. But you say Yidati Tlingit, the Tlingit of today. So that's talking about like us as Tlingit people, not the long ago Tlingit people. So that's just one sort of way to think about now. When you're sort of talking about a verb and you use this word, yesu.
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 Yes.
Yes.
Yesu.
Yes.
That's sort of tying
Yes.
the verb to right now. And it could, there's a couple different ways that this Yesu is used. If you have cha in front of it, cha Yesu, it usually means like it's still happening. Like, you know, like let's say I stood up to give a speech, and then you're getting a little tired of hearing my speech, and so you walked out, and then you came back in, wow, he's still talking? And so like you come back in and giving this big Tlingit speech, and it's just teasing about that. But if like a clan, someone was in a cultural context standing up talking, like they get to just talk. They get to talk as long as they want to. If they're like some sort of
I think a student would say that.
yeah, that's a,
Yanaka, what you said there. Like, wow, holy, he's still talking.
ha, Chayesu Yukayatunk.
Aha, Jesu, yeah, tongue.
So if you look for, like, if you just typed in Yesu in the verb dictionary, or still, S-T-I-L-L, you'll find a whole bunch of Yesu examples in there, right? So it could also mean like it's happening right now. So this is the sort of, this is where the moment is, something is happening. Before something happens, you have Ashukat.
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 In terms of time and space, Ashukat also means in front of something. So in front of is generally before. And this gets a little tricky sometimes. But you could say Ashukat would be like if you're saying before this thing happened, this other thing happened. This is something that you could use to talk about that. You could also change this to other, like I could say, Akshukat hat iyagut. You got here before I did. So Akshukat would be before me. And so this could be used in a few different ways, right? To go after.
Yanaka, Kune. Ashukat. Yeah. Yeah. Yawani.
Akshukat hat iyagut. Akshukat hat iyagut.
Ashukat hat yagut.
So that's the shukat part, is before.
Ashuhat.
Akshukat.
Yeah, good.
Here, I'll put it on here so we can see it.
Ashuhat. Joya Yanaka, Kune.
Equity. So let me write it. I'll put it on this, right on the screen.
Goodness cheese. Hund. Shukat. Hat. Yeah, good.
Hat iyagut.
Hat iyagut.
You got here before I did. And so you could change this verb too. You say Akshukat yachisacha ve'atcha. You ate all the food before I did. You know, so we could think of some different examples you could use in here. But the shukat part is sort of saying in front of. Again, there's some Tlingit philosophies in here that are deeply embedded in time and what you're supposed to do. I was listening to this recording of my great grandpa, and he's speaking in Tlingit, and then he breaks into English and he says, "Some people try to get ahead of us." And you know, and I got to think about what's he saying. You know, like they're trying to do this stuff before we do, or they're trying to be better than us. You know, just in the context of what he was talking about. But so just looking at a verb though, A shukat is before it. In front of it is before it. Following it is after it. Okay. So, like in English, I think you generally say the future is in front of you and the past is behind you. So I don't know if that works the same in Tlingit. A shukat is because but it's also you say hashuka, the ones it's in front of us, and that's talking about our ancestors, because they went down this path before us, and we're supposed to follow them down the path. So after something happens, you've got three sort of general ways to talk about after something happens. And we'll just say them, then we'll come back and talk through them a little bit. Adach.
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 Itnach.
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 Aka.
Aga.
Aka. Aka.
Aga.
So these phrases can also be followed with aweh. So you can say adach aweh, itnach aweh, aka aweh. And if you're telling a story, what you're doing with those is you're sort of jumping ahead in time. There's slight differences between these three. Like the literal definitions of these, adach means from it, itnach means following it, and aka means going after it. So like it just in terms of like how could we use these in other sort of contexts, you could say adachu good, they went away from it. If you said itnachu good, I would think whatever it was, they went to follow it. So like if a deer was walking and I was hunting it, I might go, I'm going to walk after it. I'm going to follow it. Aqa would be like something is there and I'm going to go get it. So I might say, Fred Meyer, de kukwagut kahweqa. I'm going to go to Fred Meyer's for coffee. So these are all used to talk about like sort of following something. I think a dach away is sort of like this happened and then this other thing could happen because of it a little bit. Itnach is more like this thing happened, then this thing happened, then this thing happened. Aqa is sort of just generally after this thing, this other thing happened. So sometimes they tie themselves to each other a little bit more closely. Okay.
Gonna fish ahun dasa slinket yukatangi desling kon achkawe.
Achkawe. Is that it? My time?
Yahweh achkawe with that Y with the eyes. Achkawe.
Yeah, so sometimes you're going to hear gao, so like time. So if someone says yeah, that's my time. It sounds like that's what they'd say, like if they're wrapping up something, like if you're closing up your speech or something like that. Mm-hmm. My time, or my drum. You could be saying my drum as well. Okay. You can.
Akawe. Jawe.
So in these last 6 minutes here, I'm going to touch on a couple things and maybe we'll set the time aside for now. So chituk is always, right? Chituk, so it's always happening. Chituk, 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 chituk ye natisha ya hakusti. That's how our culture always is. Then there's maybe some others, maybe I'll save them for another time. So today we covered like some songs, stories that are connected to songs, senses of time. Tomorrow we'll probably do maybe a few more sort of, maybe we'll pull it back a little bit and just do something a little bit more straightforward, like how to start thinking about how a verb works and some common and useful phrases that we can start using in our day-to-day life. Like, Dana etina khatkiti, I need money, or hinach tuasaku, I want water, things like that. As far as losing conversation,
Julia Yanaka, I need money.
Dana etina khatkiti.
Dasa?
Dana etina khatkiti.
Dana itini iyakatin.
Dana itinach khatyati.
Dana itina khatyati.
Yeah, away.
Most of us.
Hey, cheese to cut you on. Which aku kako hasaw saku yan nalkwataya ya singitani. Kia. Yea away ya take agi aya. Way you gi away kanach aya. Hatu wasaku singit kinachaya yu katusha atki. Yea we kagata ak. One kanins choya katnach away. How you katangi aya. Yantis any. Shidzi. We take carton the tani. Kanachawe yat ayach. Teshayachuti. Gao teshayachuti. Yat just the cut that trinket on a car. Ajoe hatu asagu ha yukatangitsu. Atchtushayechi. Akawe. Yayesh. Hait with the she. Yakanachawe atchsati at awe yesh. Chak. Ditowasagu kanashkite ha. Hasjiji awati. Atlain at. One kanins koash outliech. Kaditowasagu aya. Awatau. Wash at aya awachakatsa. We yesh. Yewa. Achtowasagu yisaku. Katlan aya hayukatangi. Yeo achtowasagu kanachoe adaye jini. Aka wujinaya. Shkanachtushnik. Ilsingit shkashniki. Kadasa. Wasa atnanin ya yidat. Ya shingitan niki. Yeo achtowasagu yisaku. Yeo yikugi yakatangi ya yidat hoa. Adusa dutowasagu yikayatani. Yukayatangi.
Gunas cheese is sihan, gunas cheese akut. Ikayakhwan, way to yaki, ye exatini, ye architecture, ye dat. Gunas cheese akhoni, gunas cheese shatl kohesh.
Okay. So Yewe Yanshuat Yata that's how this one will wrap up. Time is really interesting. We start like sort of, sometimes I feel like when we really start examining this stuff, it gets really it gets hard. I think the English side of our brain is sometimes like, that's not how it is. That's not how time go. And so like, cause we got to reformulate a whole bunch of stuff. And so long time ago, like you see it in the old songs, old stories, they knew the world went around. They, you know, they say, "Ya the world spins around." And so sometimes they'll say, whatever you put out there, it's like it kind of rolls back in your direction. So it's thinking about like some of this stuff as well, because sometimes they'll say ka on the world, and that's like ka, like on top of something, like nadak ka. This is on the table, ka. But sometimes they'll say which is also on the world, but is like between two things, like the folds of something as well. I guess where the word for a bay comes from, like a bay of the ocean, qi or qay. So sometimes it could be between these two, between the folds of something. And then other times they'll say Shengetani Tukwani, which is the people of the world, but they're inside of it. So there's other things we're going to learn as well, like how do things relate to each other, in, on, around, above, below, and all that stuff's going to give us these new perspectives on how to think about all this stuff. Good questions, good dialogue. It was fun. And Sakanin. Justine. We'll see y'all tomorrow.
Kanan.
Jagen.
Cheese. Siagen.
Gunas cheese akun say chukanen.
Yeah. Guys have to remind me to talk about the boots tomorrow. The Juan. Because of Juan you can use sometimes to soften a command. And one time I said that to my daughter, I was like, and she said, I'm not a boot. So, okay. So
She's smart. She's a smart one.
She's just little.
Hey, what is this chagukaku? You said that in when you're talking. It's like from a long time ago, something.
Long ago people. Chagukaku. That's the plural for a person.
Oh.
People is kaku. And then kaku would be the possessed form of it.
Okay, gonna cheese.
Okay.